Welcome to this joint session of the Town of Plymouth Open Space Committee and Sustainable Plymouth. They brought together this panel for discussion of the problem of balancing conservation and development. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Ken Stone from Sustainable.
Thank you. I'm Ken Stone. I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion. I'm a member of Sustainable Plymouth's advisory board and a Precinct 16 town meeting member. A few opening comments. The EPA states that sustainability is based on a simple principle. Everything that we need for our survival and well-being depends either directly or indirectly on our natural environment. To pursue sustainability is to create and maintain the conditions under which humans and nature can exist in productive harmony. The UCLA Sustainability Committee goes on to define the practice of sustainability as recognizing how these issues are interconnected and requires a systems approach and an acknowledgement of complexity. This requires the integration of environmental health, social equity, and economic vitality in order to create a thriving, healthy, diverse, and resilient community for generations to come. That's our perspective on what sustainability means. Regarding Plymouth's unique environment, our town has approximately 24,000 acres of undeveloped land, the third highest occurrence of rare, threatened, and endangered species per square mile in Massachusetts, 36 miles of coastland, 32 globally rare coastal plain ponds and globally rare pine barrens, over 400 inland ponds. The concern is that this town, full of natural gems, has seen its population quadruple in the past 50 years. It's today over 61,000 residents, most of that growth having occurred within the last 10 years. Approximately 1,000 new residents, including apartments, are coming online this year alone, few of which are truly affordable. Continued extensions of infrastructure into rural areas will bring further increases in municipal costs and services. Traffic in town is increasing, and many people are concerned about urbanization's various impacts. Juxtaposed to these concerns are the need to expand revenue in Plymouth through commercial and industrial growth, maintaining fiscal stability in town, and addressing the ever-rising reliance on property taxes. The questions our panel will discuss tonight revolve around how the town can focus on developing sustainability while maintaining Plymouth's high quality of life and do so in a manner not detrimental to the natural environment. So we hope by the end of the evening, all of us in this room and those listening at home will leave having learned something more about these issues and possible solutions, as well as with a better understanding of how sustainability and growth are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The structure of tonight's panel discussion will be to ask 6 or 7 questions, depending upon how much time we have. We have a large panel, and with our time constraints, we will allow participants 2 minutes to respond to each question. Our timers will hold up a yellow card when 10 seconds are left and a red one when a speaker's time is ended. And I might interrupt you to thank you if perhaps you didn't notice that your time has run out. Panelists have been placed in alphabetical order, and questions will be asked first in that manner and then in reverse, alternating between questions. So the second question, the last will be first, and we'll keep moving it that way. Our panel tonight consists of Steve Bullenin, Vice Chair of the Planning Board, Catherine Harrelson of the Community Land and Water Coalition, Brian Harrington, Open Space Committee, Joanne Zygmunt, Senior Planner with the Old Colony Planning Council, Dave Peck, Vice Chair of Plymouth's Zoning Board of Appeals, and Deborah Sedaris, Executive Vice President and General Counsel for the Pine Hills LLC. It was advertised that Stephen Cole, the Executive Director of Plymouth's Regional Economic Development Foundation, would be on the panel, but events have called him away. One last comment before we begin. We selected our panel members seeking to have a variety of perspectives from among the many in town deeply involved in issues that will be discussed tonight. If we had everyone we wished on the panel tonight, we'd still be talking tomorrow morning. So we didn't do that. And though all of the panelists are representatives of various town or county boards and committees, as well as a local volunteer organization and the largest residential development in Plymouth, the responses and perspectives of each are theirs alone, and it's important to note that they are not speaking on behalf of decided policy for their respective organizations unless they clarify otherwise. So let's jump into the questions. In 2020, the Audubon Society released a report that listed the town of Plymouth as first in the state in terms of the loss of open space to development. Much of this is likely due to residential development. Last year, more single-family homes were sold in Plymouth than in any other town in the Commonwealth. At the same time, we need more affordable housing, and state regulations, particularly 40B, requires it. So the first question is, how can we address the expanding need for housing in Plymouth, affordable or otherwise, in a manner that preserves the natural character of our town? And so, Steve, if you'll start us off.
Thank you very much, Ken. Sure, no problem. 2 minutes. We can solve it. There are 3 ways that Plymouth can control its housing: regulation, incentives, and ownership of land. Regulation principally is done through our town zoning bylaws, and we already have some of the strictest zoning bylaws in the Commonwealth, and yet housing continues to grow in our rural areas. And even if we could make our housing more restrictive, 40B and other sort of state overrides prevent us from being truly in control. So rather than trying to force property owners to limit more single-family housing on large lots, we can encourage development of multifamily housing in general and affordable housing in particular. And by affordable housing, I do mean affordable housing, not what 40B calls for, which is an $1,800 a month, 1-bedroom apartment being affordable. Now, this would be a significant change for Plymouth. Plymouth is historically very averse to multifamily housing. In fact, we don't even have a section in our zoning bylaw for multifamily housing. That's how averse we are to it. But we can make some changes which will help both our rural lands and our housing issues. One would be to consider the transfer development rights bylaw. That's a bylaw in which we allow people to preserve rural land in exchange for building rights in other areas. Right now, unfortunately, it's rural land allowing you to build in rural land. Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It would make more sense if we were to change that to give development rights in those areas where we have existing infrastructure. Roads, sewers, water facilities, schools, public safety facilities. That's where we should be building. So hopefully we can actually focus on changing the way we think, and that'll lead us towards newer ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. My comments are largely in agreement with Steve. The first thing I'd like to say is that the natural character of Plymouth comes not from lot sizes or house sizes, but from our natural environment. It comes from our beaches, our lakes, our sandy soils, our pine barrens forests, and the approximately 13,000 years of indigenous history that lies right below our feet, and the 400 years of colonial history, which we're surrounded by here in Plymouth. These are the things that need to be preserved, such as the natural character of the town. That being said, I'm in agreement with Steve that the town zoning bylaws are designed to fail in the preservation of our natural character. Large tracts of land are currently zoned as rural residential, open space mixed-use development, and traditional rural village development. These, rather than prevent sprawl, actually encourage sprawl in the rural areas. I would agree with Steve, and I would say that we need to encourage multifamily residential development. There are very few zones in Plymouth that allow multifamily residential development. It's a very small percentage of the area of the town. I would say that the town zoning bylaw should be rewritten to encourage multifamily residential in large, medium, and small lot residential, all of the commercial districts, and in particularly the highway commercial district. There are large tracts of pavement, empty parking lots that could be converted to multifamily residential housing and take advantage of existing roadways, infrastructure, and highway access. Finally, I think that Plymouth should encourage policies that promote communal living, such as development near transit hubs, which can reduce the need for parking on site. And Plymouth should develop its own definition of affordable housing and not use the state's definition of affordable housing, but have it based on local income and set the bar at 30 to 50% of the median municipal income. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. We have a master plan for Plymouth, and everything that's been brought up so far is in that master plan. And I'm going to just harp on the master plan. It has some, it's been very well thought out. It's sometimes been ignored, but it's driven a lot of the decisions for building in Plymouth. It does need to be revised and updated. It was written or finished in 2004, and subsequent reviews of the master plan should include identifying and promoting residential and business development zones, as the last one did, in concert with acquiring and protecting rural lands. Following this framework would include focusing housing growth in development areas and restricting town infrastructure improvements in rural areas to rural areas. From an economic perspective, this also makes good sense in that it reduces taxpayer investments in costly town infrastructure. Considering the extreme development pressure that Plymouth has been experiencing, we need to recommit to having a good master plan and adhering to it.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. When I was invited, I was the vice chairman of the Zoning Board of Appeals, but last Saturday joined the Planning Board. But that does not change the nature of my comments. I would mirror my colleagues to my right in that both the master plan suggestions from almost 20 years ago, but using developing housing on existing disturbed land rather than cutting down trees and clearing acres for even a single house, using existing infrastructure rather than extending existing infrastructure, considering higher density in those disturbed areas, so maybe even consider going higher occasionally, but taking advantage of the land has already been disturbed, infrastructure is present, and higher density is possible. And then I'd point out 40B has been mentioned, but I would also ask our legislative delegation, and this is to Kevin and others, to challenge the definitions of affordable housing in the 40B legislation. Right now, modular housing, I'd say, the trailer houses, if you can call them that, but the modular housing don't count. And in my mind, those are affordable communities, and yet the state says they aren't. If we could modify the definitions of what affordable housing is, we would already have in place a good number of affordable housing and encourage future expansion of that as an option. So as my colleagues have said, use disturbed land, take advantage of existing infrastructure, but change the definitions to include modular housing. Thank you.
Good evening. So I think I'm in a unique position on this board because I'm from the development camp. There's the red tail going up in the back. But frankly, fortunately, we had the opportunity to, with the town, create an opportunity for, I think, a development process and a development approach that was all about character of the town and making sure that we respected that in the process. So I'm talking about the Pine Hills, and I'm talking about the open space mixed-use development bylaw. That was designed to kind of address some of the topics or some of the comments that my fellow panelists have raised. Its location is next to a highway interchange, as opposed to, so the transportation connection was important. It was designed so that the infrastructure is all privately invested and privately paid for, so that it wouldn't impact the town. And in fact, an economic study that was done of the project by an independent analyst for the town determined that 90 cents out of every dollar of tax revenue goes to the town, and only 10 cents is spent on services. So it was a very unique model. And I will say it's a very unique model to try to replicate as sort of something that could happen elsewhere in town, because it was very unique. But it was extraordinary, and it gave the town an opportunity to do something and permit us to do something that was different. And the other sort of very practical comment, and I guess I got 10 seconds, so I'll wrap up, because there's a lot to say, is that in the approach to the building, it's about density, it's about preserving open space, and I think it's a model that was successful.
Good evening, everyone. I will repeat what some folks have already said this evening, and hopefully add a little bit more. I think, in a nutshell, the best way to preserve the natural character of a community is to permanently protect what you can. Obviously, that has pretty financially significant consequences. To reuse what's already developed, so to look at what you already have, and we'll talk a little bit more about options for that, I think, in another question, and then to control new development. I think oftentimes, speaking from a regional planning agency that works with 17 communities in the greater Brockton and Plymouth areas, oftentimes we hear from folks that they don't feel like their communities can control development. And actually they can to quite a significant extent. The communities and towns, can control where housing is built. They can control how it's built, what it looks like, and also who it's for, to a significant extent. Communities in a region elsewhere have successfully balanced the demand for housing with the preservation of their natural character. A really good example of that is the town of Easton. But foundational to this, which several folks have already mentioned this evening, is having a strong comprehensive master plan in conjunction with zoning bylaws and regulations that lay out a clear vision for how a community sees itself and how it wants to move forward into the future. A master planning process, for those who might not be familiar, it helps build consensus within a community, and it also reminds municipal staff as well as elected officials what a community wants for itself. It also gives developers a clear idea of what a town may or may not accept for development, so it gives some good direction, particularly for new developers who might be interested in the area. And a master plan also considers the pros and cons of all land use options, and it sets a path forward that's consistent with the community's vision. So that might include protecting more land from development through conservation or rezoning parcels of land, but a master plan can definitely lay out a lot of helpful actions.
Thank you. We'll move on to the second question. A few examples of sustainable development are energy efficiency requirements, solar on rooftops and over parking lots, preserving open space, whitening pavements and planting or preserving trees in areas with heat islands, and more permeable surfaces to establish a natural recharging of the aquifer and to reduce the runoff of effluents. The question is, what sorts of programs or incentives, zoning changes or bylaws could be established that might encourage developers to build in more sustainable manners? And we'll do this in reverse with Joanne beginning.
Thank you. What's most important, I think, is that communities build positive relationships with their developers to achieve the outcomes that are actually win-win. If you view all developers as having a red tail, I think you're kind of bound to fail, really. Sometimes, not always, building in a more sustainable manner is more expensive. That's not always the case. And often, when it is more expensive, that cost gets passed down to homeowners and renters. So there is sort of an affordability component to that discussion as well, too. However, often this additional cost, can be reduced by allowing developers to build more densely, for example. So it's important to have constructive conversations with developers that examines these trade-offs and collaboratively tries to explore the different options for them. A couple of specific examples. So first, I think it's important for communities interested in developing sustainably to really embrace smart growth principles. Culturally, it's often really difficult for folks, including myself, to accept smaller backyards, less parking spaces, and the like. That's the kind of lifestyle that we've been used to. But really, it's a trade-off if a community wants to preserve open space and minimize environmental impact. So zoning should be used to encourage compact, mixed-use development that promotes things like walkability, reduces reliance on cars, and also minimizes environmental impact. Creation of design guidelines and regulations that are in line with what kind of character you want to maintain in your community are important. And they also help to ensure that it's conducive to the smart growth that's needed in a community. Another example is building codes. So Plymouth has already adopted the stretch code, which is a more energy efficient version of the standard building code. That was a great step forward. There is now, however, what's called the Municipal Opt-in Specialized Energy Code, which focuses on net zero development. So certainly any community interested in building sustainably should also be considering adopting this new version of the building code as well.
So I'm happy to say that the Pine Hills was the first development that was recognized for its smart growth principles and continues to be the example that is on the state website for that purpose. So I agree with many of the things that have been said. As a practical matter, there are costs to building smartly, greenly, wisely, using all of those principles, and affording an opportunity for density is absolutely a way in which a builder can manage those costs and still provide an economic result for a buyer as well as the building process. And I think the other sort of important piece of this is that the tools that the town has, which they have used and implemented, also need to involve education, in the sense that buyers need to feel that there's value in that sustainable purchase as well. That they will accept smaller lots or, maybe no lawn at all. That they will accept, being in close contact with their neighbors as opposed to being, on a 1 acre parcel where you might wave to each other. And adopt the walkability, because that's a key part of the Pine Hills, is the fact that we have our neighborhoods connected through walking trails, through woods. And so that creates a wonderful lifestyle, but it also, in fact, benefits the economics and the environment and the well-being of the people who live there. So all of those things come together.
Here we go. As with question number one, I will be mirroring what some of my fellow panelists say. Both with the Zoning Board of Appeals and I think with planning, we always try to ask our developers to incorporate renewables, bike storage and bike lanes, electric vehicle charging stations, solar, trails, walking trails, bike trails, use of rain barrels. So basically, being as sensitive to the environment as we can make it. We try to do it jawboning, because maybe with the new codes arriving, there'll be more muscle to it. A lot of it's being persuasive. And looking forward, I think having some kind of bonus system for when you meet certain criteria, you might get another, either a higher density that's approved or a higher building, possibly tax abatements for anybody who's, bought, an energy efficient hot water heater or put the solar system on or any number of things. You either get a check back or you get some other incentive to do it. So it's both a carrot and stick, I hope, for both individual homeowners and developers to be able to stay ahead of the curve, not behind the curve, in environmentally sensitive things to incorporate and to be proud of. It becomes a selling feature for a property to say, we've got all of these features that go above and beyond what the minimum requirements are. Thank you.
Well, David just said what I was going to say, so I'm going to pass.
That's
All right, thank you. I am going to echo some of the previous comments on the panel as well. But my first comment is that Plymouth already does have bylaws on the books that encourage sustainability. They're just not being enforced in some particular instances. I'm going to focus on bylaw 203-2, the natural features conservation. This bylaw states that developers must preserve natural tree coverage to the greatest extent. Outside active areas of construction, all native trees greater than 6 inches in diameter shall be retained. Residential areas are required to retain an average of 4 native trees per lot. And also topsoil shall be retained except in areas of grading. Oftentimes these bylaws are not enforced. Developers are allowed to, through special permits, developers are allowed to raise an entire site, scrape the topsoil, and then replant. So I would encourage the planning board going forward to require all designs to conform to zoning bylaw 203-2 and preserve the original vegetation and topography outside of the building footprint. I would also encourage the planning board to stop issuing special permits to retain less than 30% of a site's natural state in an Area 2 or 3 aquifer protection area, and cease issuing special permits to render more than 15% of a lot impervious in an Area 2 or 3 aquifer protection area. So in general, I would encourage Plymouth to enforce the bylaws that are already on the books because they are good. I mean, Plymouth has strong laws, but we need to enforce them consistently across the board. Thank you. Thank you so much. And my last comment echoes what Joanne said about the new building stretch code, the net zero code. This has to be brought forward to town meeting as an article on the warrant, so I'd encourage Plymouth to do that as soon as possible. Thank you.
A lot of very good ideas presented and a lot of very important information. Yes, we did adopt the stretch code back in 2009. It was a great step forward. The new net zero code is being put forward. It hasn't been finalized yet. We're waiting to see what it says. But instead of waiting for the state, we need to come up with ideas that work for Plymouth, specifically for Plymouth. Friendly construction methods, energy efficiency standards, water conservation measures. And then we need to encourage our developers to do that. And the word is encourage, unfortunately, because absent certain building standards, we are not allowed to regulate anything that is covered by the building codes. That's the simple fact. The state law supersedes anything we wish to say. So we can put that stick to some degree with respect to enforcement of our existing codes and bylaws. But we also need to work on that carrot. And that carrot has a lot of possibilities. That's the kind of thing that we can do when we say we want to encourage a type of building that fits with the character of Plymouth. And that goes hand in hand with our idea of affordability as well. When we start talking about creating small green buildings, when we start creating areas of common space rather than private lawns, and when we start thinking about other alternatives, we just had to pass a bylaw that said on special occasions you can put more than one structure on a lot. Why aren't we having a space in which you can put 7 or 8 tiny houses on a lot? Make those affordable, because we do have issues with how affordable housing and how we can do it. And size matters when it comes to that. So we need to start looking at Plymouth-specific solutions, and I think we can do it.
I'm going to ask people to please refrain from applause, commentary, scowling, any of such manner until we're done. Thank you. Third question. The results of the municipality vulnerability study performed a few years ago has identified numerous areas of concern associated with climate changes that impact on infrastructure development and the town's fiscal health. How can Plymouth best plan to address these climate-related vulnerabilities? And you want to start it off again?
The answer to the question is actually contained in the question. Planning. Being proactive instead of reactive. On this panel tonight are 3 people who are engaged in our master plan update. Myself, Mr. Peck, and Ms. Zygmunt. We're working to try and come up with a format that presents to the residents the opportunity to truly express their views. Because ultimately, when we start talking about environmental sustainability, we have to look at, again, what is going to work for Plymouth? How do we address these problems that we're facing? Water shortage is a potential problem. We have a lot of it now, but we need to make sure we use it and that we make sure its quality stays. We are seeing droughts every year. Every year now, a drought situation. That's something we need to address. 100-year storms seem to occur every other year. I must be much older than I think I am. Things that we need to address. So we need to engage in meaningful planning, and that also means meaningful data, because we can't operate based on ignorance. There's a lot of sentimentality that goes into planning decisions in some instances. The I remember what it was like when I was a kid kind of idea. And that's important. That's important to preserve our character, but it's not how we need to make decisions when we have to face issues like rising tides, drought conditions, deluges, and environmental threats to our aquifer. Thank you.
Thank you. Here are some of the potential vulnerabilities that Plymouth is facing due to climate change. Increased precipitation, increased flooding, increased temperatures. Sure, thank you. I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Is that better? Thank you. Plymouth is looking at increased precipitation, increased flooding, increased temperatures, drought, and sea level rise as potential consequences of climate change. One of the ways that Plymouth can seek to address some of these issues is green infrastructure. Some examples include waterways, wetlands, woodlands, wildlife habitat, areas that support native species, ecological processes, areas that improve air quality, clean water, and areas that support high quality of life. Green infrastructure preserves the natural environment, and it also recognizes the economic value of the existing natural landscape. Some of the values of green infrastructure include limiting peak runoff rates during storms, maximizing the resiliency of coastal areas to flooding and sea level rise, maximizing local groundwater recharge, maintaining an inherent ecological value of an area, improving the quality of life, and preventing flooding in flood-prone areas. Some green infrastructure features that Plymouth can develop include intact dunes, tidal and non-tidal wetlands, riparian corridors, maintaining a forested upland, incorporating green infrastructure into stormwater design, implementing a green infrastructure stormwater design standard, focusing on complete streets. And in order to implement these, I believe the town should see investment in land conservation as an investment in infrastructure. And my final point is that Mass Audubon has a tool called Mapping and Prioritizing Parcels for Resilience, and planners can prioritize parcels for conservation based on climate resiliency value and connection to other natural landscapes. Thank you.
I want to focus on coastal issues and our master plan. we are living on one of the fastest warming ocean regions on the planet. We're going to be seeing sea level change, and this should be a central issue in our future planning. We need to reimagine our shorelines, harbors, and coastal development areas. They also can be an opportunity to reimagine coastal recreation and coastal access in Plymouth, both of which should be key elements in our planning as a tourist destination. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Brian. I have on my responses, create and maintain more open space, period. But I liked, the less cutting, more replanting. It seems to me, the clear cutting and, it's never a break even. We lose more than we restore. I think over time, the planned retreat from the coasts, we can do it by planning ahead, or we'll do it when the storm comes and that house or those houses will retreat, thanks to the weather. But we need to do long-range planning to bring back from that vulnerable coast structures. And one particular thing I would like to see restored, the conservation guidelines that this town had up until about a year ago, and which really were thoughtfully preserving our ponds and lakes, and were made kind of more vulnerable to development. So I would like to restore those conservation guidelines from about a year ago and earlier. Thank you.
So again, I certainly do agree with many of the comments that have been made. Planning for climate change, it has to be done at both the town level, the state level, and in the private sector as well, and that's critical. Some of the tactical approaches that have been taken in the Pine Hills to address this have been, again, open space in and between the neighborhoods. Again, 2/3 of the entirety of the Pine Hills is open space and both natural and recreational. But also taking advantage of natural drainage areas like kettle holes and canes, rather than structured drainage, so that you're, again, really recharging as much as possible into the aquifer. The zoning that allows for smaller lots, direct infiltration of roof drains, which returns rainwater back to the aquifer, less emphasis on manicured landscaping, and more naturalized native plantings are all ways to address the need for, frankly, for less irrigation, because the plantings are appropriate to the environment. Again, it's an education process. We operate a water system as part of the development, and that requires us having in place a seasonal restriction, which we've had in place every year for the last, I think, 6 now. It's not drought-driven. It's simply driven by the fact that we want to make sure that we're preserving the drinking water resources for what they should be used for. And so it's incorporating those kinds of practices and policies into how you manage the space, how you manage community, how you manage the town.
I think all my fellow panelists here tonight are onto something. The fact is that all the good practices for this, and even best practices, are known. And it is about planning, but also about getting it done. And so my comment really is about the getting it done part of things. I think that communities, including Plymouth, have municipal vulnerability plans. Use them. Invest also in town staff that do planning and also that do your grant writing. Several communities in our region don't have town planners. Or don't have anybody whose sole responsibility is to seek grant funding. Right now, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, particularly at the federal level, to bring funds into local communities for climate resiliency and environmental sustainability more generally. But you can't do that unless you've got the staff to pursue those grants. Also, cooperation is really important. You can't rely on a municipality to solve all of these problems at just the municipal level. You're going to need federal and state cooperation. You're also going to need collaboration with community-based organizations, local businesses, nonprofits, and a whole ton of other folks. A municipality itself might be able to plan for and implement, for example, protections for infrastructure resilience, but they're not going to be able to address the overheating of homes for vulnerable populations like older folks or folks with respiratory problems. That's a community effort. So I think noting the need for cooperation on these issues is very important, as well as for following plans that you have and making sure that you're resourced as a community to do that.
Thank you. We'll move on to question 4. Plymouth is located directly on top of its drinking water supply, the Plymouth Carver Sole Source Aquifer. Development and the location of projects puts pressure on the system, calling for more wells. Sand and gravel mining not only clears large areas of forested land, but also removes protective contaminant filtering layers above the aquifer. In addition, the town's many ponds, which directly affect the aquifer, have seen large outbreaks of cyanobacteria over the last few summers. Cesspools, faulty septic systems, and phosphorus and nitrogen runoff from lawns and agriculture are thought to be the contributing factors. Increased commercial developments will also require more water. Can you comment on the impact of development on the quantity and quality of our drinking water supply and how to best conserve and protect our water resources? And Joanne, if you could start us off.
So this question alone, I think, could be several hours worth of discussion, like many of these other questions. I cannot comment on the impact of development on water supply here in Plymouth. I genuinely don't know enough about the specifics to be able to have something useful to say about that. But I can certainly say something that's probably pretty obvious, and that's to understand what the problems are first and then develop the solutions. It sounds simple, but actually a lot of communities don't really understand why they're having water problems in the first place, so why cyanobacteria might be a problem in specific ponds or other water bodies. So really understanding what the problems are and then developing solutions, I think, is first and foremost for a lot of these issues. Water is often forgotten about and just comes out of our tap. And it needs to be remembered that there's a lot more to it than just that. So if there are many cesspools and faulty septic systems in town, yeah, that's a huge problem, but it's also a problem that can be worked toward to solve. So for example, my organization, Old Colony Planning Council, we administer a septic loan program for some municipalities that allows residents to borrow money at a low interest rate to actually repair their systems. Some municipalities run their own program. I'm not sure if Plymouth does. Other folks on the panel might know. But running and promoting programs like these certainly helps address some of these problems. I think, like with other issues we've discussed tonight, building codes, zoning, design guidelines, regulations, these are all things that can help address these problems as well. So through these, for example, a community can encourage more permeable surfaces. It can also limit development on land crucial to the protection of water supply. There's a fantastic tool, I think it's going to be the second shout out from Mass Audubon this evening, but there's a fantastic tool that Mass Audubon has that helps municipalities assess their bylaws for low impact development, which in turn will help improve or protect water quality. So this is just one example of a resource that can certainly be used by a community to try and help with this issue.
So under the Open Space Mixed Use Development Bylaw, the Pine Hills Master Plan required that there be private water resources and private sewer. Now that sewer initially was contemplated to be a combination of a treatment facility for the commercial area and on-site septic systems for most of the residential. As we got into the project, it became clear that the most protective way we could proceed in terms of the aquifer was to sewer as much of the building as we could, the build out of the project. And so we have ended up with a treatment facility that in fact does provide services for all of the residential and all of the commercial in the Pine Hills. What that also did was it allowed us, frankly, by having a plant that is being used by more entities, you actually have a more economic and a more operationally efficient plant. And so encouraging even with the town system, encouraging people, if there is an available sewer facility to tie into, there's a benefit to the town, not simply because you get another paying customer, but you actually get efficiencies in the way that the plant is operated, and you get the benefit of that infrastructure investment that's been made. And there were other sort of tweaks that we've made to that system over time. We have a green infrastructure called a seashell scrubber, which is a type of way to do odor control that is, again, fully a green technology and reusing seashells. We were actually the first place in the United States to adopt that. It was a technology that came out of Ireland. And we also use and I'm going to have to wrap up, but we also have an ability to use the water that is nutrient rich to irrigate the golf courses. So I'll let it go with that.
This indeed is more than a 2-minute conversation. So much to say. Clearly, water-saving devices by every citizen of Plymouth all the way up through major development is a key thing. Deborah mentioned irrigation. I happen to think banning lawn irrigation or managing it much more tightly, separately metering it, so if people so choose, but that uses an awful lot of water that affects the overall water. I'd point out it's more than drinking. Having been on the ZPA and looking at the larger projects, the fire department is deeply worried about water availability during the summertime because the sprinkler systems in our commercial buildings and schools and will not work well if you have insufficient water. So it's not just drinking, it's public safety. I would also push that, again, with zoning, and I think my planning board colleagues, on major projects, we look for peer review. We want to bring science. We don't trust, it's the trust but verify kind of approach to things. Developers will often come with their scientists and their engineers and say, no problem, everything works just fine. It's peer review that either confirms that, but as often as not, challenges it and said, no, you're wrong. Most recently, if people remember the Claremont project, which we looked at, it was peer review that discovered that the town had a water shortage and shortfall that they're now dealing with. But peer review of impacts on the aquifer are really important. So I trust science, but just water saving across the board from our house to the major developments is important.
Our aquifer isn't just a puddle. It's a flowing body of water, and generally it flows from western directions towards eastern directions. And all of our lakes and all of our ponds are little mirrors into this aquifer. We're learning that water coming through our lakes and ponds is often tainted from developments and practices that are upstream, up aquifer stream from an area that might be having problems with cyanobacteria or things of this sort. This is all just another way of trying to say we need to plan carefully for where we're going to allow development, where we're going to encourage it, where we're going to have open areas that we protect and try and maintain the water quality. And a plan with bylaws to back it is essential to doing this. We've been able to get away with it for the last 20 or 30 years, but not for the next 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to echo what several of the panelists had said, and that water conservation is one of the pathways forward for Plymouth for sustainable use of the aquifer in terms of increased residential development. This past winter, Plymouth issued a draft water conservation framework called the Case for Water Conservation in Plymouth, and I would encourage Plymouth to adopt the measures recommended by this plan as quickly as possible. The plan states that a water savings budget of 15% over current withdrawals is possible over the next 15 years. Water conservation is cost competitive with drilling new supply wells. And if these water-saving measures are implemented, it could stave off the need for new withdrawal wells in Plymouth for several years. The way to decrease demand on the aquifer is to decrease peak demand, and the peak demand occurs in the summertime. Withdrawals in July are 70 to 80% higher than withdrawals from the aquifer in January. And the way to regulate this is through seasonal water rates. The plan recommends actually increasing water rates over the summer and decreasing water rates over the wintertime in order to discourage all of this, massive water use over the summer. And this water use is coming from the, outdoor watering of lawns, golf courses, businesses, landscaping, and that sort of thing. So if the water rates were structured differently, then it would actually increase conservation. And the plan recommends that the water department works with local businesses in order to implement water conservation measures so as not to be impacted by these increase in water rates. So it's not a net increase in revenue for the town, it's a structure that discourages overuse in the summertime. But in order to do this, metering data has to be available to town planners. And so the plan encourages that meter data is widely available. And if I could just go on just really quickly, there's a regional plan called the Plymouth Carver Aquifer Action Plan. This plan is completely comprehensive about how to protect our aquifer. It has just a couple of recommendations, if I could just state them real quickly. Reviving the Plymouth Carver Aquifer Advisory Committee and developing a regional area-wide open space protection plan and enforceable policies for sand and gravel operations. Thank you.
Again, great information and ideas about conservation, and conservation is important. But ultimately, we need protection. We need to protect our aquifer. If our aquifer is in any way polluted, Plymouth fails as a town. So the best way to protect our aquifer is to protect our open lands, the recharge areas that literally filter our water down. I'm going to present an idea tonight that Select Board Member Harry Helm and I have been working on. It's the concept of a land bank. Land banks in general are a way to acquire, use, and hold property to achieve community goals. They're very similar to the way the CPC does things, only they are independent, more tailored to specific town needs. For instance, they are typically funded through one-time real estate transfer fees that we can tailor to our specific needs. We can create exemptions for first-time homeowners, for affordable home buyers, even people who are moving within Plymouth. So we can protect our economy while at the same time raising the kind of revenue we need to actually buy land. Additionally, a land bank would allow us to decide how we want to use the land. Right now, when you have the CPC purchase land, the state makes the decision for us. They give us 3 or 4 options. That's what we can do. If we, as a land bank, purchase property or have property donated to us, we can decide how we want to use it. That includes municipal uses such as wells. So these are opportunities that give us a chance to tailor our land use protection to Plymouth. And as a sole source aquifer community, that's something we want to do. Now, there are a lot of challenges associated with this. This is just the start of the idea, and ultimately we would have to go to the state for approval, and that'll be a big uphill battle, but it's something certainly worth looking at. And it's an example of what we're looking at in terms of planning for Plymouth's future.
Thank you. Moving on to our 5th question. Development is inevitable and commercial revenue enhancement is necessary for the town's fiscal health. Industrial parks play a role. On the other hand, a distinction could be made between expansive brick and mortar developments and other forms of economic growth. What ideas do you have to promote economic growth in manners that will add value to the town that don't focus exclusively on brick and mortars? How can we attract industry and expand our commercial revenue base in unique and sustainable manners? And Steve, why don't you continue?
Boy, I wish Stephen Cole were here right now.
Yeah.
This is one of those examples where the word sustainable goes beyond the mere physical characteristics of the town. Because to be a sustainable community, we actually have to be able to provide for the needs of our residents, and that definitely goes to our economy. When it comes to our economy, it means three things. It means broadening our commercial tax base to protect our residents from being overburdened, because a community isn't sustainable if people can't afford to live there. It means creating living wage jobs so that people can afford to live and stay in the community. Jobs in tourism, unfortunately, are not living wage jobs. And ultimately, it means providing services to the residents so that the residents don't have to leave in order to get their needs met. Some of the things that we require do require physical structures, but we do have, as was mentioned, a lot of empty physical structures. And we should be reusing rather than building new whenever possible. We should incentivize that. Additionally, right now, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 12% of Plymouth's population is working from home. A lot of that is actually new startup businesses. But our zoning bylaw doesn't really accommodate that. We classify buildings as either commercial or residential. We need to be a little more flexible when it comes to that. Allow residential buildings to create flex spaces so that people can work from home and still grow and expand a business. This would be particularly beneficial to one of our greatest communities, the medical community. Again, a lot of treatment has to take place in a physical building. But in the interim, telehealth has grown, and we have a lot of opportunities for that in the future as well. So we do have opportunities to think of land use and sustainability in connection with our economy.
Thank you, Steve. This is not my area of expertise, so, thanks, sorry about that, I keep forgetting. I'm going to do the best I can, but I'll leave this question up to the other panelists. Just looking at a map of Plymouth and familiarizing myself with the town, the only thought that occurred to me was that Plymouth actually, in fact, has a lot of native industries here already. There's a municipal airport, there are farms, there are schools, there's a hospital, there's a wastewater treatment plant, and waste management services. Plus, the renewable energy industry is growing and only will continue to grow. Offshore wind is being planned for outside of Cape Cod. This will require electrical engineers. And so my only point tonight is to advocate for vocational training and increase training opportunities for the citizens of Plymouth and increase education opportunities so that people can live, learn, grow, and stay here in Plymouth, and that we don't lose talent to other towns. So thank you.
I'm not a business person, and I'm a biologist, and I've never paid attention to business except when I have to pay for things. But I do know that I want to live in a town that I really enjoy living in. And I think anybody that has a job wants to be living in a place that they enjoy living in. And the more we can make Plymouth a pleasant place to live in, plenty of open space, not too much traffic, good public transportation, the more attractive we will be to small businesses that are looking for places to put roots down that are good places for their employees to live. And so that's where my thoughts come from.
What I've started thinking about was education, starting with the schools, that we would want to pick, forms of education that train our kids for the next generation of job opportunities. And because if there's a reservoir of talent here, industries will come here because the workers will be here in Plymouth. And that led me to think it would be terrific to continue to try to invite a college or a university or a satellite of a university come to Plymouth. Because as I think about educational hubs, both the students and the professors spin off projects and things, and they become a knowledge-based set of industries as options. And those are perhaps brick and mortar, but they might be also coming out of people's homes. But also it's a different kind of industry. It's a knowledge-based industry, and that could be an option. We should welcome college and university here. Also, I think the internet infrastructure needs to be as robust as we can possibly make it so people can work at home, can attract that functionality to here. So just like water, sewer, and other things, I think the internet infrastructure needs to be built. I would also hope that on the tourism side, cruise ships can be encouraged to drop off their people. Tourism, as people said, that may not be a perfect high-paying thing, but I like to travel. Many of you people in the audience like to. And if you look at the maps about where the cruise ships stop, they go to Newport, they go to lots of places, and they bypass Plymouth. There's no reason for them to bypass Plymouth. So I would hope that also be encouraged. Thank you.
So I think has already been said, a key to thinking about how to be creative with growing the commercial base, I think, it has to go back to zoning, as already been mentioned, and see if there aren't ways in which we can reuse properties or, and it has an adjunct to a residential, give people the opportunity to work from home a little more easily, have businesses that are compatible with a residential area. I also think that it's important for the town, again, to look at what resources do you already have and are you maximizing those opportunities. To me, the best source of future business is the business you've got, and whether those folks who've already said, hey, Plymouth is the place that I want to be, that I want my business to be in, are we making it compatible for them to think about how they could grow their business and stay in the town and expand the ability to employ people here in town? Again, to me, that's a friendly audience because they've already made the choice to be here, and so how do you take advantage of that? Again, with zoning, looking at the industrial park that the town has today, are there ways in which the zoning in the industrial park can be looked at to, again, give the existing businesses an opportunity to grow and expand their businesses in that space? You're not creating, or you're not taking new land, you're just looking at what you already have committed for that use and see if you can't make it more efficient. And also, the infrastructure is there. So you can, get people to tie into the wastewater facility, tie into water, and become, and again, benefit those facilities because they are more efficiently used. So I think those are some things that the town would think about.
So pretty much everything that she said. Reuse, I think, is definitely super important. I think communities often have a lot more reuse potential than they think they might until they start looking into it. So instead of building on relatively undisturbed lands, look at ways to encourage and invest in filling in and revitalizing existing areas. This includes something we've already mentioned before tonight, increasing density. It also includes cleanup of contaminated sites that are ready then for reuse and redevelopment, and also encouraging mixed use as well too, which is often particularly important for commercial areas that might have a lot of vacant space. Mixed use can help revitalize those areas. Secondly, I think it's super important to support your local businesses. As it's been said, if they're there already, they can grow and they can employ more people and they can do better. So supporting local businesses should definitely be a top priority as well. Everybody should be shopping local when they can, also encouraging organizations to have events and campaigns that promote local businesses and entrepreneurs. The Plymouth Area Chamber of Commerce, if folks aren't signed up for the newsletter, sign up for that. They actually have really great communications about new businesses that are opening in the area and events that are happening, and also some really great stuff. And finally, and this can get quite complex quite easily, but there are a lot of impediments to growth locally as well too that can be removed. So for example, parking minimums, those are regulations that mandate a minimum number of parking spaces based on building size or business type and other factors. They're in place to ensure that there's sufficient parking, but often they can actually limit business development by making it more expensive to get going. So if you envision, for example, a 2-floor building, the bottom is a restaurant, that restaurant's only using parking space in the evening. you should be able to allow them to share that same parking space with the business that's upstairs in order to maximize spaceage use. So the more barriers that can be removed locally, the better for the local economy.
So our sixth question, some of you may have already answered, but it's the flip side of this last one, which has to do with traditional commercial development. And the question is, how much commercially zoned space is available in Plymouth? Are there ways we could make better use of the space that is already commercially zoned? And where, if necessary, could additional space be located that would have minimal impact on Plymouth's traffic and natural environment? And Joanne?
I think a lot of this was addressed in my previous comments. I think reuse is really important here. I'm going to take the opportunity to throw out kind of what might be a new idea to some. Right now, zoning is based on use, how you use the building. The zoning codes have certain rules and restrictions for sites, site location, and footage from the front and all kinds of things. There's another way to do zoning that's called form-based code. And instead, that form of code looks to regulate what buildings look like. So a lot of communities are moving in that direction of regulating form to maintain the character of their community, but also at the same time remove some of these impediments to, like, working at home, for example, that often exist with the traditional form of code. So there are definitely kind of newer ideas, and they're not actually that new. They're happening all around the country in many communities. Brockton, for example, here in Massachusetts is also looking at form-based code. That's certainly one thing to explore as well, too, for a community like Plymouth.
So I'm not sure I have a lot to add to what I previously said, but I do think one of the things to think about, that the town should think about, is, and again, in keeping with the concept of the character of the town and preserving the character of the town, towns or cities that have large commercial industrial bases have it because they happen to be fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, to be located in places that had, the transportation hub to support that, had some kind of a natural resource that was necessary to sort of establish that industrial use. And then they carried that forward. I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's an industrial place. And that's key to the survival of the city, but it certainly doesn't have the character of Plymouth. So I think one of the things you have to think about is how much can and should the town try to build that commercial or industrial base beyond what it has? And is that really a reliable source of tax revenue? There's always that tension. There's a sense that commercial revenue is good, and it is. But the value and the thing that sort of is attractive about Plymouth is that it is a wonderful place to live. And so it's attractive, and it's tempting to say, well, the solution is more commercial. I don't know if that's the solution, if you're really trying to preserve and maintain the character of the town.
In answer to the specific question, I don't know exactly how much we have that's commercially zoned. I would mirror my colleagues about repurposing existing space in existing buildings. As a retired architect, there are tremendous creative opportunities to transform existing buildings and take advantage of the foundations and all the infrastructure and make something special, besides repurposing it for use, but also as an urban design feature. It will make all the space around them better with well-designed buildings. And otherwise, again, I just mirror what my colleague said and yield my time to my colleague on the right. Yeah.
Well, I also have no idea how much space we have allotted in our industrial parks. We have geographically a huge area to deal with in Plymouth, and we talk about the character of Plymouth, but we have lots of different character in Plymouth. We have lots of different neighborhoods. And again, I think I come back to planning every time. If we plan carefully, we have room for more small businesses to take root in Plymouth. And there is a need, I'm told, to do this for our tax base. And I think with some good planning, we can figure out a way to make space for more suitable businesses to come into Plymouth. We have to have the open space too.
Thanks. I don't as well know how much area of Plymouth is zoned for commercial. I do know that there are a couple of very large industrial parks in Plymouth that have a lot of great infrastructure and a lot of paving and a lot of asphalt. And unfortunately, this seems like a missed opportunity for sustainable growth in the city. So I would encourage, like I said earlier, rezoning these districts to allow multifamily residential in the same space. I would encourage Plymouth to allow for residential development on top of commercial development. Like I said, I think it's a missed opportunity that we didn't build apartment buildings on top of Home Depot or on top of Big Lots or on top of Lowe's or something like that. That being said, I believe there is a parking requirement for commercial development in Plymouth, such as a certain number of parking spaces have to be included. So I think Plymouth should look into waiving the parking requirement for businesses going forward that are zoned commercially, but this would have to go hand in hand with an increase in public transportation, perhaps an intertown trolley to take people from commercial districts to residential districts. But I think that there's opportunity for improvement. So thank you.
When we talk about commercial growth in Plymouth, traditionally we've talked about, and I keep hearing the big box stores, retail. Retail is not what Plymouth needs. We always need a certain amount of retail. I want to shop local. I want our local businesses to come. But we don't need more retail as a means of enhancing Plymouth's economy. We need the right type of commercial business that comes here. Again, the types of businesses that provide living wage jobs and services that our residents need at all levels. Medical is wonderful. Trades. Try and find a plumber or an electrician. This is an opportunity that we have to create generational businesses here. That's what we should be looking at. We should be looking at ways to do that. We actually have plenty of commercial space. We have lots of open space. There are more open plots in our industrial park than there are buildings. We have areas that are otherwise zoned commercial. I know some of them are undeveloped as yet, and I would prefer to see them undeveloped, but at the same time, they are the areas we have designated for development. I do worry about residential encroaching on our commercial space. Not that it's a bad idea. I think that mixed use is a great idea. But we need to make sure that we do at least maintain that commercial space. One of the problems we find when we try and get medium-sized commercial businesses in is that we actually don't have large enough lots to do it. I do not encourage the efforts to chase after big corporations. We're not the right place for that. Plymouth is not going to be one of those places where we have a 30% commercial base, but we certainly should be able to increase our commercial base with the right types of businesses and jobs.
Thank you. We wanted to leave people who are listening and people in the room with some idea as residents what they might be able to do themselves. So the question is, in a sentence or two, what are your top recommended actions for a citizen to take who is concerned with the continued increase in development in Plymouth? And
I'll do it in one sentence if you'll allow me hyphens.
yeah, two.
Get informed. Get involved, get out and vote. That's what we need to do.
Attend planning board meetings, second and fourth Wednesday of the month, 7 p.m.
Give up commuting and work from home.
Support our new master plan. It's going to come to fall town meeting. Support it and then participate in the planning process, which will go on for up to 2 years after it's approved. So it's a thorough community involvement process, planning for the next 10 to 20 years. Participate in the master plan.
So ask your town officials, the folks who are here on this panel, to balance the incentives between getting the sustainable results you want, balanced with making sure that people have a place to live, businesses have a place to grow and locate, and again, I think I will also say the education piece is critical. So that's my suggestions.
Pay attention to what's happening. Advocate for what you want to see. So not just fight against what you don't want, but specifically advocate for what you want. And most importantly, convince everyone you know to do the same thing.
Thank you. We have about 25, 30 people in the audience and another 32 online at the moment. And we thought we'd leave a little bit of time for a question or two, and we probably only have time for just that, a question or two from anybody in the audience that might have one they'd like to ask. If you do have one, hopefully you can make it a question versus a dialogue, and we'll take some time to do that. You had your hand up first, and then.
Into the microphone, Diane, if you could turn your microphone on.
Deborah, I honestly don't know the answer to this because I don't live in the Pine Hills, but I have friends who live there who bitterly complain about the fact that they can't put solar panels up, they can't hang out their laundry, lawns. And so how exactly do the HOA rules get established? Is that management imposed, or does it come from the residents, or what?
So it's a little bit of both. There's an overall framework that was put into place for what I'll call the Pine Hills writ large, and then underneath, and think of that as an umbrella, and then underneath that are the individual residential districts that are representative of the residents who live in those particular neighborhoods. So it's a little bit of both. A neighborhood set of rules can't be less restrictive than the big umbrella rules, but they can be more restrictive. And that is the case when it comes to solar panels, as an example. Some of the neighborhoods have more restrictive rules than the Pine Hills umbrella writ large does. For example, again, lawns, again, those are, again, very much specific to each neighborhood. There are some neighborhoods that have no lawns at all, and then there are some where at least apparently the majority of the residents in that neighborhood, because they vote in the board and the HOA and the various committees, seem to support that. As I mentioned, we, as an operator of a public water system, we have put into place restrictions on irrigation during the summer seasons to no more than 3 days a week. And again, that's not drought driven. If there's a drought, there's a whole different layer of restriction. And we also have on the common area irrigation or common area landscaping, we have an entirely separate permit from DEP for that, and that has very specific requirements for maintenance of the systems, for use of drought-tolerant species, again, allocates a very specific amount of water that can be used and then no more. So, and it gets read every 2 weeks during the season. So we notify constantly the associations if they are in violation or running up against their allocation. And then those meters are pulled and tested. So we have a very specific and I think a very good framework for controlling the common area irrigation. And trying to make sure that is as efficient as possible. And that's a first of its kind permit that the state issued. State doesn't usually issue permits for irrigation, and we asked for it because we wanted to make sure we could control it.
Thank you, Deborah.
Good evening. The town of Plymouth has 6 master plans since 2004. And number 7, I hope, will come soon. In addition, we have our own planning department studies, such as development transfer rights, housing production plan 2019, affordable housing plan, update to July 2013 update, 2 RKG economic development plans, and others, and all of them repeat the same sermon: stop urban sprawl by building compact developments, build multifamily, mid-rise housing with commercial spaces to save pristine land and get more revenues than from the single-family housing. Build affordable housing, whatever it means, but preserve the natural environment by the same time. Preserve the character and the quality of life, which is Plymouth longer. I'm coming to the question, Ken, okay? These revelations passed through countless meetings of planning board, finance committee, select board, town's legal counsel, approved by the town meeting, and then buried in the vast nebula of Plymouth storage bins. The question, Ken, is why? Thank you.
We don't have 6 master plans. We did a master plan, 2004, adopted in 2006. It has not been updated since. We are in the process of doing that. We do village master plans. Those are guidelines that have local involvement in each of the 5 village centers plus downtown. We do not have another townwide master plan. We need one. We're working on it. But most important to the master plan and to all of this planning is the community. We, on this panel, in your town government, we don't decide what goes into the master plan. The residents do. We don't decide what should happen to the town. The residents do. When I hear people say, we have all these studies, why aren't we doing anything with them? We do a lot with them. Our planning department spends a lot of time working with our various studies. But if you want to change our zoning, don't yell at us. Go to town meeting. They make the decision. When we present ideas to town meeting, that's what they are. They're ideas. And town meeting is your representative who makes that final determination. And sometimes town meeting disagrees with our plans. Our master plan since 2004 has contained a request, a suggestion, that we adopt accessory dwelling units as a means, for example, to handle some of the affordable housing issues, to transfer property generationally, to allow our seniors to stay in place. That's been presented to town meeting twice. It's been rejected by town meeting twice. Don't yell at the government, at the planning board, the ZBA, the select board. Talk to your town meeting representatives. If you disagree with them, let them know. If you agree, then they're making the decision for you, and that's what's happening.
Art Disclosures. Thank you to the panel. Just tremendous. Thank you for organizing. My question is about Massachusetts state government and its interface with Plymouth. So in your mind, what 2 or 3 things can Massachusetts state government do to help us in this sustainability space, or not do?
I think certainly one of the things that that can be done is to support municipalities in accessing funds that are actually available to implement a lot of things. One of the biggest burdens for many of our communities, and a little bit less so with Plymouth, because you guys have a planning department, is actually applying for grant monies from federal and state government. All the money that the state gets and puts out, it goes through a grant process. They don't just hand it out to communities for the most part. You have to apply for it and you have to compete for it. Often you get rejected for it. It takes a lot of time to try and go after that money. So asking the state to help support municipalities in accessing it, I think, is certainly one important thing.
One more question, and then we'll have to call it a night.
Do you think expanding the height restriction to 35 feet in the commercial zones, expanding that would help economic development in the town?
I certainly think it's worth considering. Again, another time I wish Steve and Cole were here. We get occasional requests to increase the height. We haven't seen a huge demand where people have come and said, well, I'd love to build a facility, but you don't allow me enough density. But it's certainly worth doing an exploration to see whether or not that would make a change. I certainly think that, again, if we're going to increase height anywhere, it should be in our, and I like to start calling it a business park rather than an industrial park. It should be in those commercial areas and certainly away from our residential areas.
Okay, I'm told we actually have a little more time, so I'm going to ask a question. I didn't hear much about, or anything, I think, about, well, a little bit, about ecotourism in the town. And that as a source of revenue that, again, generally doesn't require brick and mortar. And some things have been proposed in the past, but I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any ideas about that.
Just based on my research, ecotourism supports a $2 billion industry in the state of Massachusetts and over 9,000 jobs. Tourism is currently Plymouth's #1 revenue generator for the town. And so I believe Plymouth should continue to focus on forest and nature-based recreation. However, I think this would require an investment in the Parks Department and in the conservation officers as well. As we have more people moving into the town, I think that we need to strengthen our protections for our natural resources, and that's an opportunity for job growth as well. So, thank you.
So I want to thank the panel for coming tonight. It was, I think, a wonderful discussion, a lot of good information. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight and the folks online. And hopefully we'll continue the conversation. Have a good evening.